I would now like to introduce today's presenters. Ronak is the Vice President in the Technology Practice covering digital transformation and applications. He covers horizontal technology areas such as AI, APIs, blockchain, data and analytics, and enterprise application. Michael, Chief Research Officer, guides the practice research agenda and architecture by leveraging his extensive experience to identify and unlock emerging trends. Nitish, Vice President, is a member of the technology practice covering digital transformation and applications. He covers horizontal technology areas across AI, automation, data and analytics, interactive services, and IoT. Rita is Everest Group's Principal Analyst for Impact Sourcing and Sustainability. Her focus delivers a triple bottom line lens of people, planet, and profits to global services market research, beginning with an in-depth examination into the impact sourcing. And with that, I would like to turn things over to Michael. Thank you.
All right, thank you, and hello, everybody. First of all, I wanted to recognize Rita, one of our newest members to our team. Say hi, Rita.
Hi, Michael. Thanks for welcoming me.
Yeah, she brings a completely new dimensions. I think many of you know that we have a very quantitative focus on research, and she brings a little bit of a different capability there. So we're excited to have her on board. The topic for the webinar today is on digital for good, talking about your sustainability journey. And I think most of you are familiar with, kind of Everest Group as talking about sourcing techniques, market sizes, service providers, rates, things like that. And this is a fairly new topic for us, something you're going to see much more from us in the future, along with Rita to help us through that journey ourselves. And so today's webinar, we're going to talk about these. We're going to give a little bit of a kind of a background to what we're seeing in this area. We'll talk about some of the operating models for sustainability, so we get into the actual how part of the dialogue. But what we wanted to do is start with a level setting quick poll. And so what we're going to do before we get into actually explaining the definitions, we want to come up with your perceptions of what you believe are the top 3 sustainability objectives. So this is a multiple choice, but in your own thought process, before we get into explaining our definitions and some of our thoughts here, we wanted to hear from you. So go ahead, let's get started with you giving us some input on where you think the definition of sustainability objectives are for your organization. So we'll leave it open for another 10 seconds here. Okay, let's wrap this up here. All right, so Nitish, what I see here is lots of fragmentation here in terms of the answer. It wasn't just one answer stood out way above everybody else. I mean, there is the carbon footprint net zero, which I think is more traditional sustainability. But there's a lot of answers, a lot of checks, and a lot of different aspects here. What was your first impression?
Yep, Michael, thanks for that. So as you said, not entirely surprising. I think we see 2 factors at play here. One, people use different terms to describe sustainability, so there's not really a consensus around what this means, and that's you see reflected in a high consensus on a few options there. I think the second thing which this poll reaffirms is the higher focus on carbon footprint or all things environmental in that ESG spectrum, which tends to be the low-hanging fruit or the immediate area of focus for a lot of our stakeholders. So on both in terms of the consensus and where the principal focus is, this is pretty much aligned to what we see in the market.
Okay, so this gives us a good footprint of what our audience is. And now we're going to go ahead and provide some definitional and some contextual conversation of the actual data like we're well known for.
Absolutely. So Michael, thanks for teeing this up. So everybody, welcome to this webinar. What we'll try and focus on is how we see sustainability in terms of adoption in the marketplace, some helpful frameworks to think about the discussion, and then really focus on the operational model for sustainability. Because as Michael said, we really want to get into the weeds of how we scale this and how this can improve the use of digital technologies for these objectives. So if we just talk about the market context for a moment, so what you see here are two very interesting data points. On the left side of the chart, you see how people are reporting sustainability. So this reflects what the large or the S&P 500 firms do in terms of reporting for sustainability, which is a key area of focus for a lot of enterprises right now. So over 90% of all S&P 500 firms, which obviously are the large global enterprises, do some sort of sustainability reporting, which is a significant increase from where we were 7 or 8 years ago. So there's been positive movement on the reporting front. If you now look at the supply side, which is how do service providers, large suppliers that we track and interact with, how do they think about sustainability and message to the market? This data point is really telling. So of all the investments that we've been tracking for the large top 30 IT service providers, which together encompass about $300 billion of annual services spend, ever since you started tracking them meaningfully from 2010, 51% of all of their investments in sustainability have been announced in the last 14 or 15 months. So that tells you about the pace of change, about where the market is, and what now clients, consumers, and partners expect from the suppliers as well. So what we're trying to really say, and what we're also seeing from our customers, is both in terms of clients consuming these technologies as a means for advancing their goals, and suppliers are really focusing on this and also messaging to the market, which is really a sign of intent. Messaging and reporting is all well and good. We don't want the focus to be only left on that. So Rita, are we also seeing this manifest in terms of competitive advantage, value proposition for other stakeholders?
Absolutely, Nitish. I think those data points were really helpful, but when the rubber hits the road, we do see that purpose is a competitive advantage. It's not just a do-gooder activity. And probably the reason that most of the participants are here on this webinar is because they see the same thing. But we thought we'd share a couple of examples, interesting examples. Patagonia is a B Corp or a benefit corporation. And what's interesting about what you see here is that they actually advertised about addressing the issue of consumerism, and they advertised that don't buy this jacket. We're building a different kind of capitalism. We're building different kinds of products that will change the way we operate. So therefore, they sort of thought really outside of the box on this. Airbnb also leveraging their core business, which is being a platform for hosts, leveraging that core business to have a real impact on a social need, and then seeing that have an extended business benefit. Again, this is in their core area, and very interesting example. And third, we've got Unilever, which in many ways is the standard bearer when it comes to sustainability and purpose. But what we're seeing here is that it's the effect is trickling into their employee base, as opposed to it just being about their products and the way consumers see their products. So these are just some examples of how sustainability is happening on the ground.
Yeah, and again, I think Rita and Nitish, I think you've kind of teed it up really well, right? Because there is a end user, employee, stakeholder, multi-stakeholder impact of these, and at the same time, businesses in the last 18 months or so have realized that they need to be more resilient, sustainable for the future. And what we have seen is this is resulting into several actions, right, at the government, regional levels, in terms of creating targets for carbon emission reductions at an enterprise corporate level. But at the same time, there are actions around other aspects of the ESG that we were talking about, right? The social bit of it, right? The governance bit of it. And again, pretty interesting examples of somebody like Facebook talking about how they're investing into driving buying from more diverse suppliers, right? How are they investing into different businesses? I think that for us is a sign of more things to come out here, and that's one thing we definitely want to highlight out here. But Rita, I think as I think of this, right, if you could talk about how has this sustainability conversation evolved over time, right? That would be really helpful.
Sure, and I think already in our webinar, we've seen the use of a couple of different words being used. We can advance to the next slide and see many, many words that are out there about this subject. Really, we wanted to talk about how the conversation has evolved over time. And it's no judgment call on any of these activities. It's just more to say there's a lot of different activities that have happened over time. At the beginning of the sustainability journey, it was a lot of focus was on checkbook philanthropy and having a license to operate and having social responsibility. As we moved into the second phase of triple bottom line or people, planet, profits, we started to think about how do we mitigate the negative effects that we might have on people and planets. So with this risk, looking at risks as well. And then as we move into the responsible business phase, we start to see sustainability as a business opportunity. And we saw that in a couple of our slides, that there are folks that are actually making money doing this, and that's not a bad thing. And that sustainability becomes more of an enabler. And now we really talk a lot more about a purpose-driven movement, that the purpose of business is not only shareholder maximization, it's now stakeholder engagement. And the announcement that was made a couple of years ago by the Business Roundtable sort of got that movement starting to talk about a purpose-driven corporation. So moving into how this.
Rita, before we move on there.
Sorry, Michael.
So this is not necessarily about one definition's right or wrong. These are not meant to be mutually exclusive. You have to be in, everybody needs to be moving to 4 at the exclusion of 1 or 2 or 3. It's really a combination here that makes it work. That's
right. That's how the evolution is. Yep.
Yeah. So I mean, I expect, everybody's going to look at it and say, hey, we do some of 1, we do some of 3, we do some of 4, and look at that and say, well, now what's the right mix for us?
Yeah. And that's gonna be part of the journey, I think, of figuring out what that right mix is. Exactly.
Yeah. So as we think about the the journey or the different levels of the sustainability here, we build our own framework to really describe what we mean by this. And on the next slide, what we'll start to do here, if you think about this industry in the long-term view, it was really built on cost savings. And this industry will continue to focus in on cost savings as a key value proposition, whether that was leverage of, in the old days, it was leverage of the capital of a $30 million machine or a data center, or labor arbitrage, which was a big deal at a historical part of this industry. Scale is an important part of it. In the last 10 years, we probably focus a little bit more on the industry expertise, so value propositions that serve the business beyond some of the initial value propositions. So I think this third dimension here, the one we're talking about today, is something we need to continue to explore here. And what I was hoping you could do is drill down on this and tell us what you mean by this.
That's a helpful way to tee things up. I remember from my old days in sourcing that productivity was the big thing that we got measured on. But in today's day and age, as you go through that sustainability journey, it's the message here is that you can't do it alone. We've created this framework combining the elements of a triple bottom line approach and the ESG, or environmental, social, and governance approach. But adding to all of that, a business case and the fact that governance in our industry has a lot more to do with monitoring and managing all of these systems. I think how different this is from how this relates to our industry is possibly my bias is more on the social side. So part of the reason that we pulled out social and environment is to say that that's really part of the key areas of focus. While environmental issues are important, they're relatively easy to identify, benchmark, and assess, while the social benefits are often harder to identify, where there's potential impact, whether it's positive or negative. And therefore, that's the sort of vision that we have in this framework of purpose.
And so, you saw the number one answer in that first quick poll, which was largely around the carbon footprint. So I think what we're trying to do is make sure that this is inclusive of the more than that, and it's really focusing on what drives this industry, which is the people.
That's right.
And Rita and Michael, as we think about moving on this journey, right? So becoming more purpose driven, there are definitely a lot of challenges on the way. I think one thing that we've seen through our analysis and research is ecosystems in some ways eliminates or helps overcome the barriers, right? Because they can drive collaboration, they can drive risk sharing mechanisms. For example, the regulatory and industry bodies, they allow for standardization in terms of how do you measure, monitor, report, and then communicate to each other, but at the same time drives the governance bit of aspects of the purpose framework that you talked about. So they play a big role out here, and that space is kind of expanding and kind of becoming more mature, and more conversations is happening around that. And the other component of this, which is the sustainability enablers, I think they've been there for a long time. I think now they're getting more empowered. We are seeing significant traction in what you would call as the impact sourcing bit of it, right? How do you do sourcing which drives those benefits and impact, right? What does that means as part of your overall sourcing strategy in general is becoming a key question that we're getting asked. And again, that for us is a critical element that we need to focus, and the ecosystem brings it together, right? So then hence we believe it's the external components of regulatory, industry bodies, sustainability enablers that help you to kind of overcome a lot of these by expanding the area of coverage, but also enabling risk sharing, standardization of sorts. And definitely there is a technology component to it, and we're going to talk a lot about it in terms of digital and how they're driving. But what we are seeing, the good part is the data providers, right? Specifically, we're seeing there are not just data providers which are more ESG in general, but they're also specialized data providers who are going deep into one of these areas. They are focused for certain industries, certain lines of businesses, and for certain action items. And what they're trying to now drive is the ability to have more cleaner data, better quality of data to kind of make these decisions and guide this journey. And definitely you can't implement and execute it without the right set of partners, right? So having the right consultants who can help you design and develop the roadmap, to the technology partners who can bring the solutions and implement it for you, are all going to be a big part of it. So the hyperscalers, the consulting service providers, all of these will play a big role. And again, this ecosystem is, I would say, this is more of an illustrative framework of thinking. This is, I think, expanding, right? Because this coalition that is kind of coming up together is putting pressure, right? It's kind of creating more urgency to act. And that's where we believe this is going to be a critical component of how each one of us thinks of our own purpose-driven journey, is how do we work with the ecosystem. And definitely technology will play a role. And I'm hoping, Nitish, you could talk about how that kind of feeds into this discussion.
Absolutely. Thanks, Ronak. I think it's all about the ecosystem. And as we move to the next slide, we'll start to think a little bit about how technology plays the role of a strong catalyst or an enabler. Technology by itself, as we think about the operating model next, you'll see is not the only answer, but it's a strong catalyst. So what you have on this is interesting. So here are the top 5 technologies that we see our end user clients investing in from a sustainability standpoint. Now, these technologies are not working in isolation. They are often used as in the context of broader digital transformation. So the technologies themselves might not be very unique or a surprise to the group today. But what's interesting is, what are the end objectives that are being achieved through these technologies? I already see some questions from the audience around how does IT solutioning and other aspects of this come into the picture, which we'll come to. But it's really recognizing what impact these technologies can have, and then choosing the right technology, the best fit technology, versus thinking of technology as a silver bullet. So to give you a few examples, just given the focus and momentum behind cloud computing at scale, there's a lot of optimization from a data center, real estate, utility standpoint that can happen with environmentally friendly cloud initiatives, whether it's optimizing the data center itself, but also how do you think about using the right workloads based on the carbon footprint. We recently published something around how video conferencing, and it's a bit ironical, we're all on video and talking about it, adds a lot of carbon footprint. So can you optimize that in day-to-day workings as well, and have that as alerts to your workforce? From AI and analytics to really focus on the vast amounts of data for ESG, to cybersecurity and risk governance from a GRC standpoint, mixed reality to improve experience of end users, but also virtual customer engagement, and then IoT from a supply chain traceability safety standpoint. So, these are just some of the use cases. This is not exhaustive by any stretch, but the key message is really thinking about the end objectives first, and then thinking about these technologies as tools in your arsenal is what we recommend clients.
Okay, so we're definitely want to make sure that we're indicating that this is more than just changing reporting and something that you do for your shareholders or stakeholders at the end of the quarter. This is something that's really built in, starts to get built into the culture of the organization. It gets built into the way you do business with not only with your employees, but also the way that you do it with your clients and that overall larger ecosystem. So what we're going to drive into now is really that operating model for sustainability. And before we get into our slides on that, we wanted to get another quick poll, get some input from you in terms of what do you see the challenges? What are those key challenges as you execute your sustainability strategy? What are the obstacles you're running into? So let's open up the quick poll and go ahead and this is, I believe you can only choose one option here. Okay, we'll leave it open for another 10 seconds here. We have two front runners in this answer here, and okay, we'll leave it open for another 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right, so that operational framework was not surprising to see that here. It's as the definitions in the marketplace change, the operational frameworks to make it run, but close second there is the data to get this right. And so I think what people are looks like they're yearning here for is the ability to kind of have that overriding framework to think about this, but then also have the data to support that. So Nitish, you've been digging into this area here and you've been doing some work for clients on this very specific issue. How has that worked in real life, and what do you think of these answers?
Sure, Michael. And I have to admit that I think the group that we have today is very self-aware, because I was glad to see that technology was not the number one thing that people voted for. 70% was split between operations and data, because as you said, it's not the silver bullet, and we have to really think about the ecosystem around it. So, but I'm glad to see that's already happening in the marketplace. So this is our framework on how do we operationalize and sustain this market. So what we're starting to think about is what are the different components. You can think of them as Lego blocks. You can think of them as composable blocks as you think about sustainability. But what does that really mean in terms of what do you need to solve for? And it really came down to 5 components for us. So you have data, technology, and operations. And as you see, they are not independent of each other. They are uniquely linked. So you can't really decouple them, because you need the right data in the right format to understand where you are and not just report to the market. You need to have the right technology at the center of this, because everything is technology enabled. And then you choose the right fit. You need to think about operations, because you really can't scale it without thinking of the operational framework. And no surprises that was the number one thing that people spoke about. But all of this has to be really underpinned by the elements of governance and talent, because those cut across. We already know talent for digital skills, for next generation skills is in short supply. I think it's easier to find a unicorn out there than the right talent. So how do you think about now talent for sustainability becomes a critical challenge and an opportunity? And then how do you govern this? Because some of the goalposts might shift as we go on this journey, but also we'll start to think about continually changing it, course correcting, depending on how the markets move. So this is really our attempt to frame the conversation on the operating model to help scale sustainability. And as we think about some of this, I think what's also interesting is if you start with the centerpiece for all of this, which is data. I know, Ronak, you're going to talk about that, but that's where you want to start from and then talk about the other elements.
Yeah. And again, if you see on the next slide, right, which is from a data aspect perspective, I think it's very important to understand that. And again, this was one of the top 2 challenges, right? So it's kind of, I think everybody's aware that yes, having the right data to be able to measure and monitor your progress is going to be important, so that you can set up goals and then you can track towards those goals. But we believe there is another aspect of data, which is, hey, how do you take business decisions which are powered by data? So if I'm kind of building new products, if you're building new experiences, you're going into new markets, you're kind of choosing new suppliers, what data do you need to make those decisions so that your decisions are more purpose driven becomes very critical as part of the strategy. So what we see out here is, there is a need to define and measure those targets, but at the same time use that data and analytics prowess to kind of guide all decisions that you make, right? And again, how do you become that data driven, purpose driven vehicle is going to be important. And for that, you will need partners. And again, as we spoke about on the ecosystem slide, right, you will need your data providers who can bring this right data at the right time with the right quality so that you can use those data to make those decisions. You will need data analytics and technology vendors who can help you make sense of it by using analytics tools, even cognitive tools for that matter. And how do you make sense of it? And last but not the least is, there are folks who can audit this data, govern this data for you, so that you know that you are on the right path and you have that external support and help out here. And this is pretty critical, because what we've seen is getting the data strategy right can help you build the entire foundations of what technology, what operations, how do you govern, what people do you need, which skills do you need to be able to do it. So I do believe this is the crux of the matter as you start solving the purpose driven equation here. And Nitish, you would want to talk about some of the technology and services aspect of this, as to how this kind of translates into it.
Yep, that's true. And I think we really start with the data, but then start to think about what's the enabling technology state around it. This is a fairly busy slide, so I won't walk through all of this. And the second thing that's also important to bear in mind is this is an illustrative view of some of the services that these layers encompass. This is by no means exhaustive, but there are a few key messages. So the first one is, it's really important to think about different layers within your technology stack, from advisory to applications and data, which Ronak alluded to earlier, your cloud and infrastructure, given the massive footprint a lot of these enterprises have, and this will continue to expand from a governance standpoint, from a communication standpoint, to both internally to your employees, but also communication to your streets, to your partners, to your suppliers. And there are a set of underlying themes which are enabling this, from decarbonization to impact sourcing to diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, and many more. But the important thing to note here is, one, as an organization, as an enterprise who's trying to move the needle on sustainability, they're trying to tackle some, if not all of these layers. But when they do this, a lot of their suppliers end up focusing on the advisory and the consulting piece. And while that's good, I think that's often the tip of the spear. That's the starting point. It should not just end there, because there's a lot of downstream implication of how you can scale sustainability across your technology estate. And that's why we believe suppliers and partners who can do this end to end will help clients in running and scaling these programs. One of the things we're starting to see from clients is, when they start on this journey, they know they want to do something, but how they do it and how they get to the endpoint is not entirely clear. So helping clients run and scale these programs, but also envision these programs, is the big opportunity. The second takeaway almost becomes that having these capabilities end to end helps you in getting involved in these activities and help clients design these programs, because not all of them originate in an RFP. Clients are still thinking through the implications of the sustainability commitments. And the last thing I encourage people to think about is, this is really, from a supplier standpoint, a market making activity. This is something you can create with clients because they're still working through this. Your clients don't know what they don't know, and they're open to ideas. So this is really for more blue sky innovation versus following playbooks from your past. And doing this will become all the more important as we evolve. If we move to the next slide, what we'll see is how sustainability is also at the core of some of these multi-decadal shifts in technology and enterprise computing. So if you just think about cloud, and we like to think about cloud in different levels of or layers of maturity. And if you really think of where we are in the cloud transformation journey, which is cloud 3.0, sustainability is one of the critical elements on which all big hyperscale providers, cloud providers, and application players are trying to infuse messaging in their offerings to the market. And this will only grow. Despite the massive growth that we've seen in technologies like cloud, we really have to think about the fact that nearly 2/3 or 3/4 of all workloads are yet to move to the cloud. So there is a lot of optimization effort that can be lent to some of these large technologies, such as cloud computing. And obviously this impacts other things such as AI and blockchain as we go forward. But sustainability is really at the core of some of these more secular shifts in the market. As we think about sustainability from a technology perspective, Ronak, are we starting to see that get impacted because of downstream operations as well?
Definitely, Nitish. And again, if you look at on the slide, right, which is where we are talking about operations, and we have taken a few examples, right, which is how do you now make sustainability or the purpose-driven framework, as Rita and Michael talked about, how do you make this as a focus of all the different operations that we do? And again, we have examples across, the finance functions, sales, marketing, supply chain. But I can, given I've spent a lot of my time with financial services, it will be even hard not to kind of talk about the vertical specific operations also, right? For simple things like international remittances, how do we reduce the cost of operations around international remittances so that the kind of the population who uses those services are most of the from developing or emerging economies, and how do we help them to kind of send money back home in a less cheaper manner, faster manner, right? I think those are the kind of impact that you generate from those. Think about it from a supply chain perspective, right? Which is, it's not just about creating more resilient, more efficient, more transparency in the supply chain, but at the same time we need to also think about how do we drive responsible sourcing, right? How do we drive sustainability of the entire supply chain, right? How do we look at the overall carbon emission? How do we look at diversity in terms of the suppliers that we have? I think there are several aspects of it. And again, what we believe is, as you look at moving from the traditional way of looking at operations to building what we would call as purpose-driven operations, it's going to be very important to create those measures of how are we looking at sustainability, how are we kind of measuring them, and how are we kind of enabling them. And that will kind of lead to designing operations and the entire organizations towards these common goals. And definitely there is a component of how do we measure all of this and govern all of this. And Rita, I would definitely want to hear from you, right? As we think of business operations, IT operations, and the organizational actions that we take overall, right? How does the entire governance aspect of this operational framework come together?
Thanks, Ronak. And I'm glad to hear financial inclusion getting discussed on this webinar. And maybe it's the first time the phrase got used in an Everest Group webinar. So cutting across the operating model is governance. And what we'll say at the top of the model is the rise of the CXOs with environmental and social responsibilities. Leading from the front is definitely happening. We hear them by different names. They are sustainability officers, responsibility officers, purpose officers, sometimes CSR officers. They're really talking about, they're really creating the vision and strategy which is meant to be integrated across the overall business. And especially as the Business Roundtable that redefine the purpose of business. The middle layer is translating that vision and strategy into the relevance across business units, creating monitoring mechanisms and tracking the progress to the goals that are set out. And then finally, the action layer is implementing across the business units, embedding, and that's where you see it actually getting embedded into the DNA of the organization. In incorporating, and in many ways, it's about the collaboration that then happens at that layer that gets fed back in. And I think that's where we also start talking about the fact that sustainability is becoming a talent conversation, that it's a skill that's cutting across every business unit, every business function, and even becoming as well-known and as necessary as just general problem solving. So there's a lot of different interesting examples that are emerging today across providers and enterprises in thinking about this governance structure in these sort of major buckets. In terms of the next slide on sustainability governance models, We have compliance as, we can shift to the next slide, please, sorry. Are we frozen? Well, I'll start talking about what we are thinking about in terms of, there we go. This is a really simple concept of saying that compliance, such as ethical labor practices and environmental regulations, in many ways over time, they've really been the spark that lights the match that is now building into a competitive advantage and shifting purpose into a stakeholder conversation. And that's where we see the differentiation on sustainability as a competitive advantage. Michael, I think I'm handing it over to you.
Yeah, so before we do that, Nitish, I got a question for you here. You're doing some work with clients on this right now. And, you know, I think maybe it's helpful to kind of bring this to life on exactly what seems to be the opportunity here that folks are asking us to help them with.
Absolutely, Michael. And that's a very interesting point, because to me, this is proof of the fact that people are now operationalizing these sustainability investments versus just talking about this in an esoteric manner. And we see that happening with our client set. A lot of us in the audience might already know about how Everest Group works, but we really serve people who are end users, suppliers, or enabling this ecosystem. And we're seeing very different problem statements from all three. From end users, Michael, what we are starting to see are questions around how green and how sustainable is my supplier landscape? Can you help me run a fact-based check on my supplier landscape and their credentials for sustainability? And how should that inform my sourcing decisions? We are starting to see these kind of conversations happen at the sourcing and the RFP stage as well, where they're including sustainability or want sustainability as a part of the scoring model, the evaluation criteria right up front. From a supplier standpoint, what we're starting to see are questions around who is doing what and what does differentiation and sustainability start to look like? Because this market, like a lot of other technologies and other movements, has moved faster than what I think most of us anticipated. And Rita joining us is proof of that we are putting serious efforts behind this. So from a supplier standpoint, it's really about where does the market go in the next 12, 18 months? What are my competitors doing? How do I differentiate and work with clients? And then from an investment standpoint, because we end up working with a lot of private equity and VC firms, they're really trying to think about what are the implications from an operating model standpoint. So the 5 things that we've discussed today, and which technology targets, assets out there stand to benefit or can help clients move the needle on sustainability. So very different questions, but all about things that are happening here and now versus too far in the future.
Yeah, and Peter, Rita, and I were having a conversation last week, and we were talking about how this becomes competitive advantage for the service providers, not just a reporting exercise. And I think that's super, super key here. Is if this is just about changing some quarterly reporting, that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about creating competitive advantage, whether that be with your clients or with your employees. I think those are both equally important here. I'm surprised how fast the needle has moved in the talent pool on this being an important dimension. So I think that's something else we're gonna come into play here. So, all right. So with that, one of the best ways to engage with Everest, we find, is to get started. And so with that, Nitish and Ronak and Rita have put up an offer for you to take advantage of your enterprise. So if you're on the buy side of this equation, the opportunity here is just to get a report, or get a report and a conversation with the team. And what we're asking here is choose one of these as a priority here. Are you interested in data offering for sustainability, technology solutions, or designing a roadmap for sustainability? If those are interesting to you, click the link, and we'll be in touch to follow up with you to have a conversation. So, all right, I'll leave this open for 3, 2, 1. All right, and with that, thank you for your participation there. All right, we're going to do one last data chart or data slide here, and this is also another quick poll, so this gives you an opportunity to kind of chime in here. And I'm going to put the chart up here and the words here, but I want Rita to kind of explain what we mean by this. So how do you expect your sustainability spend to change in the next 12 to 18 months? And Rita, can you help here with what that really means?
Sure. In fact, I think this has been a theme that we've seen throughout the webinar of what it means to spend on sustainability. Clearly, people are a big, important part of that and the skills that they bring along, the technology, the different investments. In fact, I think even one of our first slides really talked about the increases of investment in sustainability. So I think folks know what we mean by spending in sustainability, but I'd like to emphasize, again, putting on my social hat, my do-gooder hat, that we're also curious about the categories of spend. Are you looking at mitigating impacts, such as reducing your carbon footprint, versus improving a social or environmental condition like impact sourcing? So yeah,
right.
Very curious to see these results.
All right, let's go ahead and share the results here. Obviously, lots of numbers leaning toward the increase here, so that's an encouraging sign there, Rita. There are some there that are actually looking at decreasing their spend on this dimension. So I think we got to make sure we understand that as well. Any thoughts there?
Yeah, I think it is interesting to see some declines in what's driving that. Maybe there were some very large investments in this odd pandemic year, but I am heartened to see that the majority are looking at very large increases in spend and hoping to be part of that and see what all those categories are of the spend.
Okay. All right. So let's bring this to a close here with a couple slides. The first one talking about how we expect this to evolve over the next 12 to 24 months. So we've talked about how it's evolved through history, but let's talk about how you see it further evolving specifically in this industry.
So these are some lofty expectations, but in many ways, I think this pandemic has pushed envelopes for people personally as well as professionally. So we see four areas that we see evolution. First, we've already spoken about it, talent across the business, and that sustainability is going to become more of a soft skill. We're going to continue to see reporting. Sunlight is a great disinfectant, so we will continue to see the momentum on reporting, but we'll see it with more rigor and transparency, especially with a lot of the service providers that are out there helping with this. One of the things that I'm most excited about is thinking about going from unintended consequences to intentional consequences, specifically when it comes to having a positive social impact. And that's again back to my impact sourcing bandwagon that I keep getting onto. And finally, I think we are seeing a lot more discussion about a reimagined capitalism or a new vision of capitalism that's more inclusive, that's got I don't know that there's a better word than inclusive, but that it looks different and leaves fewer people behind. And I think our next conversation is to get into a little more detail on what the maturity continuum looks like for sustainability.
Yeah. And I think, Rita, I think this is helpful, right? Because I think one of the questions that, Nitish and I keep getting a lot is, for a business or an enterprise, where are we on that journey and where are our peers, right? So just understanding the maturity of what you are doing versus your peers and putting it into the context of the elements of it, right? Which is, what's the vision and objectives of it? Why am I doing this? What are the ways to measure this initiatives? What are the commitments we are making for purpose-driven kind of disclosures? How is the ecosystem structured? What are the elements of governance? And then most importantly, right, which is, how do we enable all of this through data, technology, and other aspects of it? And what we've seen is it's a sort of an evolution of a maturity curve, because what happens is you've seen there are several enterprises which are more on the social responsibility journey, which is more voluntary. It's more driven by a set of few people in the organization. It's more CSR driven, right? The way you kind of articulated in the start of the discussion. And also it's more self-reported, ad hoc and manual. There's not a lot of technology going, not a lot of data infrastructure applications being built to kind of support this journey, but there is measurements happening in terms of number of activities you're doing, the amount of money that you're kind of spending on these activities, and it's more qualitative action statements that you're kind of bringing out to kind of talk about this. But as we move to the second level of maturity is where this doesn't just become a social responsibility, but you add into the elements of level two, right? So what happens is level two is level one plus some other additional things, which is all around. Now I'm also mandated by, if I'm a public company to report my sustainability initiatives. There are investments that I need to make as a business to drive carbon reduction because there is a not just a compliance mandate, but it could also be a brand issue, right? It could also be my talent value proposition, my client value proposition that goes away. So it's a risk mitigation issue which you're trying to solve out here. So here you're using more standards, you're using more data technologies, you're using more more of the tools available in the repository in terms of using ESG funds, ESG indexes, and kind of tracking a lot of this. You are also creating more commitments including diversity in suppliers, right? You're also trying to focus on driving better diversity, inclusivity, like equity and belonging for your talent, right? So you're starting to bring those measures out here. But this is still around risk mitigation, because if you don't do this, there is going to be a perceived loss or an actual loss that you will have in terms of fine, in terms of business loss, in terms of brand loss, in terms of talent loss, which you are trying to avoid. And that's where, if you look at the third level of maturity out here, is not just about doing sustainability to kind of voluntarily or by driven through risk mitigation principles, but by actually making it a line of business. Now, in the level 3, you're doing all of that you were doing in level 1 and 2, but now what you're doing is you are creating a set of line of business, right? You have an organization structure that is created to create products and services to enable sustainability for your customers, for your clients. You're embedding sustainability and purpose-driven principles in your organization. And again, it's not happening across the organization, but there might be a business. Say, for example, a bank which is launching an ESG investing business, or an energy company which is launching a renewable energy component business or a carbon trading business. So what they're trying to do is creating a line of business to serve the sustainability needs of customers. So they're not just risk mitigating, loss avoiding, but they're earning revenue and driving growth out here. This is where they're able to attract the talent who wants to work on doing good out here, right? So their work will have value to not just their customers, but also to the broader society, community, environment. And the way you do this is not, you'll have to put in more technologies out here, right? This is where you'll have to put in technologies like IoT, data, edge computing. How do we look at energy optimization of your buildings, to how do you ensure health and safety for your employees, to several other things, right? So and again, we took the examples of international remittances, financial inclusion, and other aspects of it. Those are like businesses that you're being creating to drive benefit for your. So again, it's a growth mandate focused out here. And what we believe is the fourth level of this maturity, which is purpose driven organizations. I think this is where I would call this as the North Star target state, which is every decision that I take as an organization is being driven by these principles, right? It's being driven by purpose driven principles. So all our operations, be it business, be it IT, all our sales, all our products, all our experiences, all our channels are all being created in a manner to drive purpose driven behavior. What it means is, from a talent perspective, you need to now start training everybody with those set of skills, right? So in the earlier stages, you had a few set of people who were aware or had the skill sets to kind of do these activities. Now you are looking at doing this at an organizational scale. So everyone is aware of purpose-driven principles. Everyone is aware of how their actions result into benefits for the sustainability goals that you have set. And you are not just doing this from a self-reporting perspective, but have assurances because of third-party audits, right? You are having design principles of your entire data operations IT being designed, which is sustainability first, right? Which makes it very intrinsic to an organization. And as you think of moving across these maturity levels, is where the set of activities that you need to do will change as we are looking at it, right? So that's, I think, my I think kind of coverage of all these 4 levels and how the maturity continuum evolves. Rita, Nitesh, I know if you have any other comments that you would want to make on this slide before we hand it over to Michael.
I think you've covered it, Ronak. It's a lot of details and a lot of great conversations that we're going to have with our friends.
Yeah.
Yep.
Michael, over to you.
All right. So, obviously we're on a journey here. It's probably it's going to be some people are going to kind of get it right away. Some people are going to be looking at it and saying, "What's the big deal?" So I think our challenge will be to kind of help orchestrate, if you will, some of the definitions, some of the value propositions, highlight those service providers and those enterprises that are rising above and doing some interesting things here. Cost takeout will always be part of the value proposition, driving value, whether it be cost takeout or increasing, the customer experience or increasing the employee experience. Those are the things that will ultimately drive value. But this can go a long ways to creating new dimensions to those core values of this industry. So, all right, we're going to open it up to questions here. Feel free to answer. Put those questions in the chat window here. Let me drive to the first question. And the panel disappeared. Okay, there it is. All right. Where do you see IT solutioning come into the space of sustainability? So where's the intersection there? Anybody want to jump on that one?
I can start, and then Ronak, others feel free to add. So this is an interesting question. I think I would have 3 pieces of advice or 3 observations. One, I think even before we get to solutioning, we're starting to see sustainability come more upstream in the decision or the sourcing decision to select supplier. So your sustainability credentials, even if not explicitly asked in the RFP, we're starting to see enterprises consider that as a key requirement for selection. I think the second thing is during solutioning, we're starting to see enterprises be more receptive to helping inform how they should think about their technology choice and the underlying sustainability footprint. For instance, in the massive move towards cloud-based transformation, we are starting to see enterprises be more receptive to their suppliers' ideas on how they can optimize different workloads, even if it's not explicitly asked. And the third thing is being proactive is key. Because of this openness, because of the fact that they're still figuring this out, as you said, Michael, everybody's on this journey together. If suppliers and partners and service providers proactively position this, that is often appreciated because that's something that might not be a part of the stated goals, but is very much a part of the corporate agenda.
Yeah, and Nitish, one thing on that one is when we are creating business cases for IT solutioning, right? What is the impact of this, right? And typically, again, Michael said, right, you're talking about cost impact, time to market, experience, efficiency. We believe there is going to be a sustainability impact, right? So you're looking at a cloud migration solutioning project. Hey, what is the sustainability impact of it? And so on and so forth for every other product solution that you're building. So I think that's also very critical from an element around there.
All right, the next question is around a study that we actually did, Everest Group did about 5 years ago with the Rockefeller Foundation regarding South Africa. And Rita, I think you mentioned you actually had visibility to that study way before you joined us. And so what are your thoughts on the question is, how has the landscape changed for impact sourcing? And are you seeing global adoption globally? Are you seeing new challenges for impact sourcing? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And I will take a second to just for everyone define impact sourcing, even though I've been using it all morning. Basically, impact sourcing is where people from marginalized communities are intentionally brought into the workforce of service providers. And the idea, as Michael, you mentioned, came from Rockefeller Foundation, from sort of the social sector, but has been brought into the business sector. And I think in terms of the changes, adoption globally, it has been, and it's literally globally. It's gone from sort of the global South, the developing world, like South Africa and India, to places like rural United States or urban centers where there's high unemployment. Because there are marginalized communities everywhere, unfortunately. I think the major challenges that we're still getting into, I would say here at Everest Group, is how to publicize the model, which has a very strong business case in order to scale it. So scale is the biggest challenge, because without the scale, you're not going to have economies of scale. And we're really embarking on a journey now to put more information out there and educate the marketplace, given that there is this strong business case to intentionally tap this untapped talent.
Okay. All right. Another question here. Do you see a role for back office operations in the whole sustainability journey of financial services companies?
Yeah, Michael, I can take that one, right? So definitely I do, right? Because as we look at sustainability is now not just a compliance mandate, but a revenue driven mandate for a lot of our financial services firms and our clients. And what we've seen them is they're launching large, businesses, right? Which is, kind of creating these products from sustainable lending to sustainable investments to financial inclusion and several other products, including advisory services to clients on kind of creating a sustainable portfolio, right? Where they invest, how they invest. As we look at the back office operations, there is going to be several elements of not just, doing the operations in a manner which overall reduces the, sustainability footprint or the negative footprint of your organization, but at the same time, how do you imbibe those principles in every actions that you take, right? So the next best action that you kind of offer to your operations executive, how do you kind of train them, design them to take it in the best interest of the purpose driven framework, right? This will depend on the kind of products and experiences that you're kind of supporting, and at the same time what customer segments that you are supporting. But we do see this to be a big role. And again, from a back office operations perspective, a lot of the reporting, right, data pieces of it is also going to get impacted on how do you kind of structure activity. So there's going to be elements of a process redesign, process reengineering, and also usage of a lot of data automation technologies in back office operations to enable this. So definitely, I think this is a very strong area, and we do kind of believe that this is going to see more activity, because it's always been the front end, right, which is the product and what you're trying to drive, but it's the actual execution of it is where the back office operation is, which is where you will see more activity happening, because you can't sustain that front end without having that core back here.
All right, we've got several more questions. We're not going to get to them all here. We'll try to follow up in person or give you individual answers, but we'll take one more here. The company I work for is just starting its journey on sustainability. We find it difficult to get buy-in from senior management. Can you make some recommendations to increase adoption?
Yeah. And I think I can start, and Nitish, you want to add, right? I think on this one, what we've seen is, at least in my experience, is as you're looking at sustainability principles, you need to talk about this from a brand perspective, you need to talk about a growth perspective, and then a compliance mandate perspective. And I think if you can talk about how this will impact your brand, how this will impact your talent value proposition, your customer value proposition, and how this can be a differentiating aspect, and then how do you talk about this can actually drive revenue or growth for you and can make your business more resilient in the longer term. I think that is going to be the two pieces. And then if there are aspects of compliance, cost, and other things you can kind of bring along as you kind of do this. And that's how being the tenets of the case, business case that we're seeing out here.
Agree.
All right. Anything else, Nitish, you want to add? Any closing comments?
No, I think it's a really framing the conversation, as Ronak said, and I think in a minute we might not be able to convince them on how they move the needle, but I think reframing the conversation and focusing on value, and so something our teams can also follow up on. Okay, fantastic. All right, well, I want to thank Nitish, Ronak, and certainly thank Rita, and welcome Rita as well. We have lots of information. As if you've never been to our website, tons and tons in the on this kind of all kinds of outsourcing and sourcing and services topics. There's our latest sets of blogs are available, and also a whole list of related content here. And I'm sure that Rita and others will be adding to this list as well. So again, thank you everybody, and appreciate your time.